For 10 years, Howard Freeman had paid little attention to the peculiar mound behind his shed. But the moment he finally dug into it, he knew his quiet life would never be the same again. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and damp soil as Howard worked methodically under the beam of his tactical flashlight. At 76, his movements were slower than in his military days, but still precise, the result of habits formed during a lifetime of discipline. The shovel bit into the earth with a satisfying crunch, each scoop bringing him closer to whatever lay beneath the mysterious mound that had slowly grown taller over the decade he'd owned this property. The blade struck something solid, producing a dull metallic ring that sent a shiver up Howard's spine. He dropped to his knees, brushing away soil with gloved hands, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. As he cleared more dirt, the moonlight reflected off a smooth steel surface. A sudden movement caught his peripheral vision, a flicker of light from the tree line at the edge of his property. Howard wasn't alone. Someone was watching. With the instincts of a man who had survived a war, Howard quickly covered his discovery with loose soil. In one fluid motion, he retrieved the old .38 revolver from his belt, aimed toward the trees, and fired a warning shot. The crack echoed across the silent property. The distant light vanished instantly. Heart pounding, Howard waited, listening intently to the darkness. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone for now. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Howard's weathered hands clutched the telephone, his voice low and urgent. "Walter, I need to see you right away. I think I've dug up a missing intelligence officer's secrets, and I'm not the only one who knows about it now." 10 years earlier, when Howard Freeman first purchased the modest ranch house on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, the small mound behind the wooden shed had been nothing more than a curiosity. Just a slight rise in the earth, perhaps 30 centimeters high and 1.5 meters across. Easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The previous owners hadn't mentioned it, and the real estate agent had dismissed it as probably an old tree stump that had been removed, leaving the ground slightly elevated. Howard had accepted that explanation. At 66, newly widowed after Martha's heart took her following 43 years of marriage, he had been more concerned with starting his solitary life than with investigating quirks in the landscape. The small property, 3 acres with a weathered fence and a house that needed work, had suited him perfectly. Isolated enough for privacy, but close enough to town for necessities. Every morning since moving in, Howard had risen at precisely 5 a.m., a habit carried from his military days. He would brew coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, then walk the perimeter of his property. What he still thought of as a security check, even after all these years. The ritual provided structure and purpose to days that might otherwise blur together in retirement. Born in 1940, Howard had joined the Army at 21, serving in Korea with the 502nd Military Intelligence Battalion. His specialty wasn't combat but analysis, reading patterns, decoding messages, connecting disparate pieces of information into coherent intelligence. After Korea, he'd worked for the Department of Defense until retirement, spending decades sifting through information, identifying threats before they materialized. Those skills never left him. Even now, as an old man with silver hair and hands beginning to show the first tremors of age, Howard Freeman cataloged and analyzed his surroundings with methodical precision. He noticed things others missed, slight changes in the environment, patterns of behavior, inconsistencies that demanded explanation, like the mound behind his shed. Over the years, it had changed in ways that defied natural explanation. It grew taller, reaching nearly 60 centimeters. The grass atop it never grew as lushly as the surrounding yard. Most peculiar of all, after heavy rains when puddles formed elsewhere, the mound remained stubbornly dry, as though whatever lay beneath repelled moisture. Howard had tapped it occasionally with his boot, once hearing a faint metallic echo that he'd dismissed as imagination. Earl Peterson, his closest neighbor and fellow veteran who lived half a mile down the road, had joked about buried treasure during one of their infrequent visits. "Bet some old bootlegger stashed his goods there during Prohibition," Earl had suggested, his weathered face creasing with amusement. Howard had smiled politely but said nothing. In his professional life, he'd learned that secrets had weight. They pressed against their containers, seeking release. Sometimes, given enough time, they worked their way to the surface on their own. That autumn, after a particularly heavy downpour had washed away some of the soil, Howard noticed something different about the mound. A glint of metal had appeared at one edge, just a small corner, but unmistakably manufactured. Not stone or root, but something man-made. Standing there in the morning light, coffee cooling in the mug clutched in his hand, Howard made a decision. After 10 years of patient waiting, it was time to discover what lay beneath. The next evening, after methodically assembling his tools, shovels of various sizes, brushes, his tactical flashlight, work gloves, and the revolver he always kept clean and loaded, Howard began to dig. He approached the task with the same systematic attention he'd applied to intelligence analysis, first marking the perimeter, then starting from the side rather than the top to avoid damaging whatever might be buried. The soil came away easily at first, still soft from recent rains. As he dug deeper, it became more compact, requiring greater effort from his aging muscles. An hour into the work, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air, his shovel struck something solid. The sound was unmistakable, metal against metal, with the resonant quality of substantial thickness. Dropping to his knees, Howard began clearing dirt with his hands, revealing more of what he now could see was a rectangular box, roughly 3 feet long by 2 feet wide. What caught Howard's professional attention wasn't just the box itself, but its construction. This wasn't some random container. The material appeared to be military-grade stainless steel, mil-spec if he wasn't mistaken, with a specialized waterproof sealing compound around the edges that he recognized as developed for document transport in extreme conditions. This was the kind of container used for what the military called eyes-only materials, the highest classification of secrets. That's when he noticed the light from the tree line, the warning shot, the realization that someone else was interested in his discovery. After securing the partially excavated box for the night, covering it again with soil and positioning his garden cart over the spot, Howard spent a restless night by the window, watching for any sign of intruders. None came, but he knew they would return. Secrets had power, and power attracted attention. The following morning, Howard drove to Earl Peterson's house, bringing a photograph he'd taken of a small, exposed section of the box. He was careful not to reveal that he'd found it on his property or that he'd begun excavation. Earl, at 81, was still sharp-minded despite the oxygen tank he now required after 50 years of cigarettes. A former logistics captain in the Marines, Earl had expertise Howard respected. "Where'd you come across this?" Earl asked, squinting at the photograph through thick glasses. "Just something I saw recently," Howard replied, the evasion coming naturally after decades in intelligence. "Looked military to me. Thought you might recognize it." Earl studied the image, then nodded slowly. "That's an Alpha 7 storage container, used for eyes-only documents and sensitive evidence from about 48 to 62. He looked up, curiosity plain on his weathered face. "They don't make them anymore. Too expensive. But they were damn near indestructible. Waterproof, fireproof, even had some radiation shielding. Any idea what might be inside?" Earl shrugged. "Could be anything from classified maps to weapon specs. These weren't for routine stuff, though." He tapped the photo. "See this seal pattern? That's specific to materials that required specialized handling protocols. Might have been used by the 82nd Airborne. They were involved in some sensitive operations after the war, intelligence gathering, special activities." "The 82nd, Howard repeated, filing away the information. "They were at D-Day, Market Garden, and plenty afterwards that didn't make the history books," Earl added. "If you're really interested, you might check with the Veterans Records Center in town, or the county library's got a decent archive section." He paused, fixing Howard with a knowing look. If someone marked that box no trace, they had a reason for it. "Be careful, old friend." Howard nodded, thanking Earl for his time. On the drive home, his mind worked through the implications. The 82nd Airborne, a specialized container for classified materials, and someone watching his property after all these years. The coincidences were mounting, and in intelligence work, coincidences often pointed to connections not immediately visible. That night, with the curtains drawn and doors securely locked, Howard completed the excavation of the box, bringing it into his shed where he could examine it privately. The container was heavier than expected, requiring all his strength to lift it onto his workbench. Under the bright shop light, he could see that the years underground had done remarkably little damage to the specialized steel. The seal remained largely intact, though soil had worked its way into some of the crevices. Howard put on latex gloves and positioned his UV light to check for fingerprints or other trace evidence before opening the container. The military had trained him to preserve evidence, and old habits died hard. The latch mechanism was stiff but functional, requiring firm pressure to release. As the lid finally lifted, Howard felt a strange sense of reverence, as though he were opening a tomb rather than a box. Inside, carefully arranged and remarkably well preserved, lay several items. An army dress uniform with 82nd Airborne insignia, folded with military precision, a leather holster containing what appeared to be a Colt M1911 .145 caliber pistol, a stack of letters bound with faded ribbon, a small tin box likely containing personal effects, and a canvas bag secured with a drawstring. Howard removed the items one by one, placing them carefully on the clean cloth he'd spread across the workbench. The uniform, when unfolded, revealed sergeant's stripes and several commendation ribbons, including the Purple Heart. In the breast pocket, he found a military identification card, the name still legible, James R. Sullivan, born 1916, Sergeant U.S. Army, 82nd Airborne Division. The pistol was in remarkable condition, preserved by whatever treatment had been applied before storage and the airtight nature of the container. Howard, handling it with care, noticed immediately that the serial number had been professionally removed, acid-etched, and then polished smooth. Not the work of a common criminal, but someone with specialized knowledge. Military intelligence sometimes used unmarked weapons for operations that officially didn't exist. It was the canvas bag that delivered the first real shock. When Howard loosened the drawstring and peered inside, he found stacks of cash, old bills from the 1940s and early 1950s. A quick estimation put the amount at around $50,000, an enormous sum for that era. More tellingly, when he checked several of the serial numbers, they were non-sequential, suggesting the money hadn't come from a bank withdrawal, but from multiple sources. In that moment, Howard realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary soldier's possessions. This was the equipment of someone operating in shadows, someone who might need to disappear quickly with untraceable funds in an unmarked weapon. "What were you involved in, Sergeant Sullivan?" Howard whispered to the empty shed. "And who's still interested after all these years?" The next morning, Howard converted his living room into an analysis station, something he hadn't done since retirement. He positioned his brightest lamp over the dining table, arranged his magnifying glass, notebook, and reference materials within easy reach, and began a systematic examination of his findings. He categorized the items into logical groups: personal identification, weapon, currency, uniform, correspondence, and miscellaneous. Each category might provide different insights, and connections between them could reveal patterns not obvious when examined separately. The letters, all from Margaret Sullivan between 1946 and 1953, proved most immediately informative. Howard arranged them chronologically, noting changes in tone and content over the years. The earliest were joyful, celebrating James's return from the European theater. Later correspondence grew increasingly concerned, with veiled references to men asking questions, and the German matter. Howard applied the mice analysis technique from his intelligence training, looking for motivations involving money, ideology, compromise, or ego. The letters suggested all four elements might be present, with frequent mentions of doing what's right, ideology, alongside concerns about financial security, to money. Creating a relationship map, Howard noted every name mentioned, locations referenced, and significant dates. Several names appeared repeatedly: Dr. Werner Kleinman, Colonel Robert Harrison, and someone referred to only as K, who seemed to be a source of great concern to both James and Margaret. By midday, Howard had formulated a three-stage investigation plan. First, research publicly available information at the library. Second, check county property records. Third, if necessary, visit the Veterans Center for military records. Each stage carried increasing risk of exposure, so he would move cautiously. At the Pinewood County Library, Howard navigated to the microfilm section, requesting archives of local newspapers from 1945 to 1955. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with keen eyes behind stylish glasses, raised an eyebrow at his specific date range but asked no questions. Hours of methodical scrolling yielded results. A 1946 article titled "Local Hero Returns" featured a photograph of Sergeant James Sullivan in dress uniform. The accompanying text described him as having served with distinction in the 82nd Airborne, receiving the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism during operations in Germany. The article mentioned he had returned to Oak Ridge with his wife Margaret. A smaller piece from 1948 noted Sullivan's new position with the Office of Scientific Coordination, a name Howard recognized as one of several cover designations for aspects of Operation Paperclip, the classified program that brought German scientists to America after the war. Most significantly, a brief notice from October 1953 caught Howard's attention. Local resident missing, James Sullivan, 37, has not been seen for several weeks. Authorities have no leads at this time. The article was small, tucked between advertisements for laundry detergent and a local dance hall. No follow-up stories appeared in subsequent issues, as if Sullivan's disappearance had been quickly forgotten or deliberately minimized. The property records search yielded another crucial connection. Howard's house had indeed been built in 1951 for James and Margaret Sullivan. More interestingly, the property had been sold in 1954, not by James but by Margaret Sullivan, acting under power of attorney. The timing, just months after James's disappearance, couldn't be coincidental. As Howard left the library, military instincts long dormant flickered back to life. Was that sedan parked across the street the same one he'd passed earlier? Had the man reading a newspaper on the bench looked up a fraction too quickly? Using counter-surveillance techniques that felt like muscle memory, Howard took an indirect road home, making sudden direction changes and using reflective surfaces to check if anyone followed. Back at his property, new details jumped out at him. Tire impressions in the soft earth near his fence line, too fresh to have been there that morning. A cigarette butt near the shed that wasn't his brand. Someone had been on his property while he was gone. That night, Howard established a rudimentary alarm system, fishing lines strung across likely approach paths, connected to improvised noisemakers. He positioned his most comfortable chair by the window overlooking the shed and settled in with his revolver, a thermos of coffee, and patience cultivated through countless surveillance operations. Around 2:15 a.m., the soft tinkling of his wind chime alarm broke the silence. Howard peered through military-grade binoculars, their weight familiar in his hands. A figure in dark clothing was examining the area around the shed, moving with the disciplined precision of professional training. Howard silently made his way to the back door. By the time he reached the yard, the intruder had vanished, leaving only footprints in the damp soil, the distinctive tread pattern of modern tactical boots. The next morning brought an unexpected development. A polished black SUV pulled into Howard's driveway shortly after 9. A man in his 40s emerged, dressed in what appeared at first glance to be an official uniform, navy blue with brass buttons and a peaked cap. He approached Howard's door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. "Mr. Freeman, David Anderson, Federal Military Archives Office," the man announced when Howard answered, extending a hand and an ID card in a leather case. "We're conducting a historical survey of veterans in the area who might have military artifacts of historical significance. May I come in?" Howard's decades in intelligence had taught him to recognize inconsistencies. The ID card lacked the hologram used on federal credentials. The visitor's tie wasn't regulation length. His shoes were civilian Oxford style, not military issue. Most tellingly, there was no such agency as the Federal Military Archives Office. Yet Howard smiled pleasantly, years of counterintelligence work allowing him to hide his suspicions. Of course, always happy to help with military history. "Coffee?" He ushered Anderson into the living room, deliberately leaving some of Sullivan's letters visible on the coffee table, though he'd removed anything identifying their origin. While preparing coffee in the kitchen, Howard positioned a small mirror to observe his visitor, catching him leaning forward to examine the papers. Returning with the coffee, Howard deliberately stumbled, spilling some on his shirt. "Clumsy of me. Let me just change this quickly. Please, make yourself comfortable." The moment he was out of sight, Howard retrieved the miniature camera he'd kept from his intelligence days, returning to find Anderson rifling through the papers on the table. From the hallway unseen, Howard documented the intrusion before making a deliberate noise to alert the man of his return. Their conversation was a careful dance of questions and evasions. Anderson probed for information about military items Howard might have discovered. Howard provided vague, misleading responses. When Anderson finally left, promising to check back soon, Howard watched through the window as the man met with two others waiting in an unmarked car down the road. A thorough sweep of the living room revealed what Howard had suspected. A sophisticated listening device had been placed under his coffee table. The technology was advanced, not commercial grade, but the type used by specialized agencies. Someone was very interested in what Howard had found, and they had resources. That night, Howard took a calculated risk. Using lockpicking skills that remained sharp despite arthritis in his fingers, he gained access to the county records office after hours. The security was minimal, a basic alarm system he easily bypassed, and a single night guard who maintained a predictable patrol pattern. In the property records section, Howard found the complete file on his house, built in 1951 for James and Margaret Sullivan, sold in 1954 after James's disappearance. But the file contained something the public records hadn't: a letter from the Department of Defense dated November 1953 requesting confidentiality regarding Sullivan's status. More interesting still was a cross-reference to something called Project Alchemist, a designation Howard didn't recognize from his years in intelligence. Whatever Sullivan had been involved in, it carried a classification level beyond even Howard's former security clearance. Returning home in the pre-dawn hours, Howard immediately sensed something was wrong. The garden gnome Martha had insisted on keeping, the one he'd positioned as a marker near the back door, was slightly askew. Someone had entered his home. The fishing line stretched across the hallway confirmed it. Howard had placed it at ankle height before leaving. Now it was broken. Drawing his revolver, he moved silently through the house, checking each room with the methodical thoroughness of his training. The intruder was gone, but Howard's bedroom had been searched. The drawers were closed, but items inside had been shifted slightly. His mattress had been lifted and imperfectly replaced. Most significantly, the shed's padlock had been broken, the container and its contents examined. They knew what he had found, and they would be back. In that moment, Howard Freeman made a decision. This was no longer a curious discovery from the past. It was an active investigation, potentially involving national security, with people willing to break into a private residence to protect whatever secret lay buried in Sergeant Sullivan's possessions. He needed help from someone he could trust implicitly, someone with both the experience to understand what they were dealing with and the connections to provide protection if needed. There was only one person who fit that description. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, Howard placed a call to Walter Davis, his former comrade from the 502nd Intelligence Battalion, now retired as sheriff of Lakeside County. Their conversation was brief and coded, as if the decades since Korea had never passed. "The package we discussed has arrived," Howard said simply. Walter's response came without hesitation. "Meet me at the usual place, 1300 hours." The usual place, a reference to a diner they'd frequented during a joint operation in '74, was now a small coffee shop called Mabel's on the outskirts of Pinewood. Howard arrived early, taking a seat with his back to the wall and clear sight lines to all entrances. He brought copies of the key documents, leaving the originals secured in a waterproof container, buried beneath his garden shed, a hiding place even professional searchers might overlook. Walter Davis entered exactly on time, his imposing frame still straight despite his 74 years. The former sheriff's eyes swept the room automatically before settling on Howard. No words were exchanged until Walter had ordered coffee and the waitress had retreated out of earshot. "You look like hell, Freeman," Walter observed quietly. "Been a busy couple of days," Howard replied, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "I need your assessment on this." Walter examined the contents methodically. The photographs of Sullivan's ID and uniform, copies of the letters, images of the cash and weapon. His expression remained neutral, but Howard noted the slight tightening around his eyes when he came to the name on the identification card. "James R. Sullivan," Walter said finally, his voice barely audible. "I've seen this name before. Alsos list related to Paperclip." "Operation Paperclip?" Howard leaned forward. "The Nazi scientist program?" Walter nodded grimly. Not all of it was as clean as the official history suggests. Some of those scientists had blood on their hands. Deep red. He tapped the photograph of the letters. These need cryptographic analysis. The wife might have been using basic steganography. Hidden messages. Over the next hour, they worked through the materials together, applying intelligence techniques neither had used in years. Walter found the pattern in Margaret's letters. The first letter of each paragraph, when combined, spelled out warnings and locations. References to the German matter took on new significance with the paperclip connection. Sullivan was monitoring German scientists brought to the U.S., Walter theorized, keeping his voice low. Based on these references to Kleinman and experiments, I'd guess he discovered something about their wartime activities that someone wanted to keep buried. The money? Howard asked. Bribe or blackmail, Walter replied without hesitation. 50,000 back then would be worth close to $500,000 today, enough to disappear with or to pay for silence. The gravity of their discovery settled over them. This wasn't just historical curiosity, it was potentially evidence of covered-up war crimes and the subsequent elimination of an American soldier who threatened to expose them. We have decisions to make, Walter said finally. This touches national security, possibly international relations. The ethical implications alone? I know. Howard stared into his cooling coffee. I'm just an old intelligence analyst who dug up something in his backyard. I never expected to be holding evidence of a potential conspiracy reaching back to World War II. That's the thing about secrets, Walter replied, his expression somber. They don't stay buried forever. The Earth itself seems to want them revealed. They discussed options, weighing risks against moral obligations. Taking the evidence to current authorities might expose them to the same people who had broken into Howard's home. Doing nothing would betray the trust that James Sullivan had placed in whoever might find his hidden testament. There's a secure location, Walter suggested finally. An old fallout shelter at Cedar Ridge. We can store everything there while we determine the best course of action. Howard nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his neck. When? Tonight. Pack everything in something inconspicuous. I'll pick you up at 2100 hours. We'll take back roads, switch vehicles twice. As darkness fell, Howard prepared for the rendezvous, placing Sullivan's effects in an old fishing tackle box, an unremarkable container that wouldn't draw attention. He left behind a single item from the collection, Sergeant Sullivan's dog tags, which he placed around his own neck beneath his shirt, some form of connection to the man whose secrets he now carried. Walter arrived precisely on time, driving not his usual truck, but an older model sedan with tinted windows. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, both watching for signs of surveillance. The night was clear, stars bright in the autumn sky, as they wound through back roads toward Cedar Ridge. Neither man was surprised when flashing lights appeared behind them on a particularly isolated stretch of road. Walter pulled over, his expression grim. That's not a real police car, he said quietly, eyes on the rearview mirror. The light bar is wrong for this county. Howard tensed, hand moving toward his concealed revolver. Options? Before Walter could answer, he turned to Howard with an expression that changed everything. Regret mixed with resolution. I've known about James Sullivan for a long time, Howard. We served together in a special unit in 1950. Time seemed to stop as the implications registered. Walter hadn't just recognized Sullivan's name from a list. He had personal knowledge. Information he'd withheld until this moment. After World War II, Walter continued rapidly, Sullivan was assigned to monitor German scientists brought over under paperclip. His job was simple: make sure they were who they claimed to be, doing what they were supposed to do. The approaching headlights cast Walter's face in harsh relief as he spoke. Sullivan discovered that several scientists had connections to Ahnenerbe, the SS research organization that conducted human experiments in concentration camps. Worse, he found evidence that some American officials knew about these backgrounds and covered them up because the scientists' knowledge was deemed too valuable. Jesus, Howard whispered. Sullivan gathered evidence, prepared to blow the whistle. Then he vanished. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I always believed he was eliminated, the same men who are now interested in what you found. The false police car was 30 yards behind them now, an officer approaching with flashlight in hand. Margaret wasn't just his wife, Walter added. She was his ally, former OSS, recruited to help document what he'd found. After James disappeared, she went into hiding, changed her name, her appearance, lived until 1998. Howard's mind raced, processing this flood of new information while simultaneously assessing their tactical situation. The men behind us? Sentinel Group, Walter explained grimly. Private organization formed during the Cold War, originally protected paperclip scientists from Soviet agents, later became guardians of certain historical revisions. Not government-sanctioned anymore, but still powerful. We're surrounded, aren't we, Burge? Howard observed, noticing a second vehicle approaching from ahead. Walter nodded. Plan B, I'll create a diversion. You take the evidence through the woods to the old Westfield storage facility. Colonel Marcus Richardson will meet you there. He's still active military intelligence, one of the few I trust completely. The colonel knows about this? I contacted him when you first called me. He's been investigating fragments of this case for years. Sullivan managed to send some evidence before he disappeared, enough to launch a classified internal inquiry that's been ongoing for decades. The false officer was 20 yards away now, hand resting suspiciously near his holster. Ready? Walter asked, reaching slowly beneath his seat. Howard nodded, feeling the familiar calm of combat readiness settle over him. Age and arthritis might have slowed his body, but his mind was still sharp, his training intact. Good luck, old friend, Walter said, then threw the car into reverse, accelerating toward the surprised fake officer as Howard slipped out the passenger door into the darkness of the surrounding forest. Time is a circle that never fully closes. Secrets buried deep will always find their way back to the surface, carried upward by the inexorable pressure of truth. As Howard Freeman vanished into the trees, the tackle box clutched tight against his chest. He understood that he had become part of something much larger than himself, a story decades in the making, connecting a soldier long dead to a conspiracy still very much alive. The earth remembers what men try to forget, and sometimes, when the moment is right, it reveals its burden to those prepared to carry the weight of knowledge, regardless of the cost. The pine forest swallowed Howard like a ghost returning to familiar haunts. His 76-year-old joints protested as he navigated the uneven terrain, but decades of training had prepared his body for moments precisely like this. Each footfall deliberate, each breath controlled, he moved through the darkness with the practiced stealth of a man who once made shadows his office. Behind him, the sound of a struggle erupted, Walter creating the diversion as promised. A car door slammed, voices shouted, then a gunshot cracked the night. Howard didn't look back. In operations, emotional attachment was a liability. Walter knew the risks, just as Howard did. Their mission now transcended personal safety. The tackle box felt unnaturally heavy in his grip, its contents representing not just physical items, but the burden of history itself. Inside lay the possessions of a man who had chosen truth over self-preservation, a choice Howard now faced himself. The Westfield storage facility lay 2 miles through dense woodland, an abandoned Cold War-era supply depot that had once housed materials for rapid military mobilization. Howard had never been there, but Walter's directions were precise. Follow the creek north until it forked, then east to the chain-link fence with the rusted government warnings. His mind worked methodically as he moved, processing Walter's revelations. James Sullivan had uncovered evidence that some Operation Paperclip scientists had been involved in concentration camp experiments. American officials had concealed these backgrounds. And now, 70 years later, people were still willing to break laws to keep this buried. Some secrets never lose their power. A branch snapped somewhere to his left. Howard froze, becoming part of the landscape, controlling even his breathing to minimize vapor in the cold night air. 30 seconds passed. A deer emerged from the undergrowth, paused as if sensing his presence, then bounded away. Howard allowed himself 3 deep breaths before continuing. The forest thinned as he approached a small valley. Through gaps in the canopy, moonlight revealed the silhouette of a low industrial building surrounded by chain link topped with rusted barbed wire. The Westfield facility. Howard checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The rendezvous with Colonel Richardson was set for midnight. Approaching the perimeter, Howard surveyed the facility with tactical precision. 2 vehicles were parked near the main entrance. a black SUV with government plates and a nondescript sedan that might belong to Richardson. No sign of Sentinel Group vehicles, but that meant little. Professionals would park at distance. The fence showed signs of recent cutting and repair. Someone had breached this perimeter before. Howard found a section where the chain link was newer than surrounding areas, suggesting a previous entry point that had been discovered and fixed. 20 yards further, he found what he was looking for: fresh bolt cutter marks on the bottom of the fence, creating a flap just large enough for a man to crawl through. Positioning the tackle box ahead of him, Howard pulled himself beneath the fence, ignoring the protest of his shoulders. Age might slow the body, but it couldn't dull the techniques ingrained through years of covert operations. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings, a central administration structure flanked by 2 larger warehouses. Decades of neglect had left the complex in disrepair, with nature reclaiming portions of the concrete apron. Howard remained in the shadows, watching for movement, assessing. A figure emerged from the main building, tall, military bearing, approximately 60 years old. Even at this distance, the man's posture indicated command experience. Colonel Richardson, most likely. Howard waited, looking for signs of coercion or ambush. The colonel moved with purposeful calm, scanning the perimeter methodically, not the behavior of someone under duress. Using a small signal mirror to catch moonlight, Howard flashed the recognition sequence Walter had specified: 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. The colonel turned immediately toward the reflection, nodded once, and gestured toward a side entrance. Howard approached cautiously, tackle box held where it could be clearly seen. As he drew closer, details of the colonel's appearance became clearer. Silver hair cut military short, weathered face suggesting years in harsh conditions, eyes that evaluated rather than merely saw. "Mr. Freeman," the colonel acknowledged, voice low and controlled. "Walter spoke highly of your discretion. I'm Marcus Richardson." "Where's Walter?" Howard asked, not extending his hand, not yet relinquishing the tackle box. "Arrested by actual sheriff's deputies who responded to reports of gunfire," Richardson replied. "He's safe for now. His former position offers some protection, but we don't have much time." "Those weren't real officers who stopped us." "No, Sentinel Group has resources, including convincing costumes, but they don't have jurisdiction or legal authority." Howard studied the man's face, looking for deception. Finding none, he nodded toward the building. "Secure location?" "As secure as we'll find tonight. Swept for surveillance equipment 20 minutes ago." Inside, the administration building retained the skeletal structure of its original purpose. Faded government seals adorned peeling walls. A military-issue folding table had been set up in what once might have been a briefing room, a battery-powered tactical lamp providing harsh illumination. "I need to see what you found," Richardson said, motioning to the tackle box. Walter indicated it might complete a puzzle we've been assembling for decades. Howard placed the box on the table but kept one hand on it. "First, I need context. I'm not turning over evidence until I understand where it's going and why." The colonel's expression remained neutral, but approval flickered in his eyes. "Fair enough. What do you know about Operation Paperclip? Official version or reality?" "Start with official, then tell me where you think the gaps are." Howard organized his thoughts, switching to the analytical precision that had defined his career. Officially, Operation Paperclip brought approximately 1,600 German scientists to the United States after World War II to gain their expertise and prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. The program contributed to advances in rocketry, medicine, and various military technologies. Werner von Braun is the most famous example. His work was instrumental in getting Americans to the moon. Richardson nodded. "And the gaps?" The program overlooked the Nazi affiliations of many scientists, some of whom had been involved in war crimes. Their records were sanitized. Paper clips were literally used to attach new, cleansed biographies to their files, hence the operation's name. "Close," Richardson confirmed. "But there's another layer. Some of these scientists weren't merely Nazi Party members by necessity. A subset had direct involvement with human experimentation through the Ahnenerbe, the SS organization that conducted so-called medical research in concentration camps." Howard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Sullivan discovered this." Yes, in 1950, Sergeant James Sullivan was assigned to monitor several scientists working at a research facility in Maryland. His official role was security liaison, but his actual mission was counterintelligence, watching for signs of espionage or sabotage. Richardson began pacing, the habits of briefing rooms apparently ingrained. Sullivan was thorough. He didn't just watch the scientists. He investigated their backgrounds independently. He learned German, accessed captured SS records that hadn't been fully translated, and made connections others had missed. He found evidence of war crimes. Worse, he found evidence that certain American officials knew about these crimes and actively concealed them because the scientific knowledge was deemed too valuable to lose. Howard nodded, the pieces aligning with what Walter had revealed. The materials I've found suggest Sullivan was preparing to expose this information. He tried official channels first, Richardson explained, reported to his superiors, submitted documentation. His concerns were acknowledged, then buried. When he persisted, he began receiving threats. That's when he recruited his wife, Margaret, who had OSS experience, to help document everything. And then he disappeared. Richardson's expression hardened. He was eliminated, made to vanish. The official investigation lasted 2 weeks before being classified and closed. Howard processed this information, applying analytical frameworks to assess credibility. Richardson's account aligned with the evidence, filled logical gaps, and explained the continued interest in Sullivan's possessions. The Sentinel Group, Howard prompted, originally formed as private security for Operation Paperclip scientists, protecting them from potential Soviet assassination. Over time, they evolved into something more problematic, an organization dedicated to protecting not just the scientists but the reputation of the program itself. They've become guardians of a particular version of history. Are they government? Not officially, not anymore. They operate with private funding, largely from foundations and corporations that benefited from paperclip research. They have no legal authority, though they maintain connections with former intelligence personnel. Howard considered the implications. You said Sullivan's investigation has continued. Under whose authority? There's a small unit within Army intelligence that has maintained an independent investigation since 1978, when some of Sullivan's initial evidence resurfaced during a routine declassification review. I've headed this unit for the past 11 years. What's your endgame, Colonel? Justice for Sullivan? Exposure of Paperclip's darker side? Both would embarrass the government you serve. Richardson met Howard's gaze directly. The truth doesn't tarnish institutions. Secrets do. My objective is completion of the historical record and, where possible, justice for victims. Not publicity or retribution. Howard studied the man's face, evaluating sincerity with the tools that had kept him alive through decades of intelligence work. Finally, he nodded and opened the tackle box. Then you should see what Sergeant Sullivan thought important enough to preserve. For the next hour, they methodically examined each item from the buried container. Howard explained the circumstances of discovery, while Richardson documented everything with a small digital camera. The colonel paid particular attention to the letters, confirming Walter's assessment about steganographic messages. Margaret was using a simple first-letter code, Richardson noted, arranging the letters chronologically. Combined with context, it gives us locations, names, and dates we've been missing. The unmarked pistol prompted a long examination. Serial number removed professionally, Richardson observed. But the barrel wear pattern is distinctive. This weapon may connect to an unsolved shooting from October 1953, the last week Sullivan was seen alive. The money proved especially significant. These bills, Richardson said, separating several with sequential serial numbers, appear to match a series that we know was provided to Dr. Werner Kleinman in July 1953, ostensibly relocation funds, but the amount was excessive for that purpose. Bribe money, Howard suggested, or blackmail payment. Sullivan may have confronted Kleinman with evidence of his activities at Dachau. Working together, they constructed a timeline of Sullivan's final months. April 1953, Sullivan discovers translated documents connecting Kleinman to human experiments. May-June, Sullivan reports findings through official channels, is rebuffed. July, Kleinman receives large cash payment. August, Sullivan begins documenting evidence independently with Margaret's help. September, Sullivan receives threats, begins preparation for possible escape. October, Sullivan disappears, weapon matching ballistics of his pistol used in shooting of unidentified man near Baltimore. November, Department of Defense issues confidentiality notice regarding Sullivan's status. 1954, Margaret Sullivan sells house and disappears. He was building a case, Howard concluded, but realized he might not live to present it. So he created a time capsule, Richardson agreed, buried it on his own property, perhaps hoping Margaret would retrieve it if something happened to him. Why didn't she? According to our records, she fled immediately after his disappearance. Military police questioned her twice. The third scheduled interview, she was gone. New identity, new location. She may not have known exactly where he buried the evidence. A distant sound interrupted their analysis. Car engines approaching from the access road. Richardson immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by moonlight through dusty windows. "Sentinel," he said quietly, moving to the window. "Two vehicles. They must have tracked us somehow." Howard joined him, assessing the tactical situation. 5 men, possibly 6. Professional movement patterns. Armed, based on their posture. "We need to move this evidence immediately. There's a secure facility 30 miles from here. They'll have the roads watched," Howard noted, "and I'm not as fast through the woods as I once was." Richardson's expression remained calm, but tension radiated from his posture. "I have reinforcements coming, but they're at least 40 minutes out. We need to buy time." Howard considered their options with the detached calculation of an experienced intelligence operative. "They want the evidence, not necessarily us. That gives us leverage." "What are you suggesting?" "Psychological operation. Create uncertainty about the location of the evidence while establishing a defensible position." Richardson raised an eyebrow, professional respect evident. "You have a plan. I'll need your sidearm and that digital camera." 5 minutes later, Howard emerged from the administration building alone, hands raised in apparent surrender. The Sentinel team had established a perimeter, using vehicles for cover, tactical lights illuminating the courtyard. "I'm unarmed," Howard called, voice steady despite the weapons trained on him. "Just an old man who dug up something he shouldn't have." A figure stepped forward, tall, athletic build, approximately 40 years old. Military bearing, but with the subtle differences that distinguish private contractors from actual service members. The man who had posed as David Anderson from the Federal Military Archives Office. "Mr. Freeman," the man acknowledged, "you've led us on quite a chase. Where's Colonel Richardson?" "Securing the evidence you're so interested in," Howard replied calmly, "though I'm not sure why old war secrets matter so much in 2025. Some matters transcend time, Mr. Freeman. Some reputations remain valuable." The man gestured toward the building. "The material you discovered belongs to the government. We're simply retrieving it." "Without badges, warrants, or legal authority," Howard observed. "Curious approach for government representatives." The leader's expression hardened. "We protect historical integrity and national interests. Sometimes that requires operational flexibility." A convenient euphemism for breaking and entering, impersonating federal officers and threatening citizens. The tactical lights cast harsh shadows across the courtyard as the Sentinel team maintained their positions. Howard cataloged details automatically. 5 visible operatives, positioned for overlapping fields of fire. Equipment suggesting private military contractors are rather than official personnel. "Where is the material, Mr. Freeman?" "The container and its contents." Howard allowed a small smile. "Currently being uploaded to several secure servers. Colonel Richardson thought the historical record should be complete." The leader's composure fractured momentarily, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle shift in posture. "You're bluffing. There hasn't been time. Digital cameras, satellite uplinks, technology makes many things possible." Howard maintained direct eye contact, employing interrogation resistance techniques in reverse. "The evidence exists in multiple locations now. What happens to me or the original materials is irrelevant." The psychological impact was immediate and visible. The leader conferred urgently with another team member, their body language conveying uncertainty. Howard had introduced a critical variable, the possibility that suppressing the physical evidence would no longer achieve their objective. "We need to speak with Colonel Richardson," the leader finally stated. I'm afraid he's occupied, Howard replied, but I am authorized to negotiate terms. This was dangerous territory, every word a calculated risk. Howard needed to maintain the illusion of leverage while buying time for Richardson's reinforcements. The success of such operations often hinged on confidence rather than actual advantage. There's nothing to negotiate, the leader responded, though his tone suggested otherwise. Those materials are classified. After 70 years, doubtful. Especially materials buried by a private citizen on private property. No classification stamps, no chain of custody. Howard took a calculated step forward, but perhaps we can accommodate concerns about contextualizing this information appropriately. The leader studied Howard with narrowed eyes. What are you proposing? A controlled release through proper historical channels. Academic review, appropriate redaction of sensitive details, focus on historical significance rather than individual culpability. This approach appealed to the Sentinel Group's core mission, not absolute secrecy, but managed narrative. Howard was offering a compromise that would allow them to shape interpretation of the evidence rather than suppress it entirely. The leader seemed to consider this, his expression calculating. And the original materials? Preserved in a government archive, available to cleared researchers under supervision. The negotiation was delicate, each party aware that the other was withholding significant information. Howard needed 18 more minutes according to his internal clock. The Sentinel team needed to determine if Richardson had actually transmitted the evidence. A new voice interrupted their standoff, authoritative, coming from the darkness beyond the tactical lights. This operation is now under military jurisdiction. Colonel Richardson emerged from the shadows, accompanied by 3 uniformed military police officers. The insignia on their tactical vests indicated INSCOM, Army Intelligence and Security Command. Captain Lawrence, Richardson addressed the Sentinel leader. Still exceeding your mandate, I see. The revelation of the leader's name and Richardson's familiar tone shifted the dynamic instantly. This wasn't a random encounter. Richardson knew this man. Colonel, Lawrence acknowledged stiffly, this is a Sentinel operation. You have no authority here. I have a federal warrant authorizing seizure of evidence related to an ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Sergeant James Sullivan, Richardson countered, producing an official document. And you have approximately 90 seconds before additional military personnel arrive to secure this facility. The standoff stretched through several 10 seconds, tactical calculations almost visible behind each man's eyes. Finally, Lawrence gestured to his team. This isn't over, Colonel. For tonight it is, Richardson replied evenly. The Sentinel team withdrew with practiced efficiency, their vehicles disappearing into the night. Only when the sound of engines had faded did Richardson approach Howard. That was an impressive performance, Mr. Freeman. Psychological operations was clearly your specialty. Just applying fundamentals, Howard replied modestly. Create uncertainty, offer acceptable alternatives, maintain confident posture. Richardson nodded toward the administration building. We need to move quickly. Lawrence won't go far. He'll regroup and attempt surveillance of our movements. Inside, Richardson's team had already secured Sullivan's possessions in specialized evidence containers. The efficiency of their operations suggested extensive experience with sensitive materials. What happens now? Howard asked as they prepared to depart. These materials go to a secure facility for proper analysis and integration with our existing evidence. Your statement will be taken, officially this time, and protective measures established for your property. And Sentinel Group? Richardson's expression hardened. They've operated in gray areas for decades, protected by connections and the sensitive nature of their mission. That protection is eroding. This evidence may finally allow us to bring them under proper oversight. What about Walter? Being released as we speak. The charges were minor, reckless driving, essentially, and his former position carries weight with local authorities. Howard nodded, relief mixing with lingering concern. And Sullivan? Will there be justice after all this time? For Sullivan himself, perhaps only historical recognition of his courage. But for the victims of the experiments he documented, yes, there can still be meaningful acknowledgement, even 70 years later. As they exited the building, Howard looked up at the stars, the same stars that had witnessed Sullivan's final days, his desperate effort to preserve truth against powerful forces determined to bury it. The weight of that connection settled over him with unexpected emotional impact. Truth is patient, Howard said quietly. It waits beneath the surface, growing stronger, while lies weaken with time. Richardson glanced at him with newfound respect. That's rather philosophical for an intelligence man. When you reach my age, Colonel, you've seen enough secrets surface to recognize the pattern. The longer truth remains buried, the more power it gathers. Like a spring compressed beyond its limits, when it finally releases, the force can be devastating. The journey back to civilization proceeded with military precision. Howard rode with Richardson in an unmarked government vehicle, Sullivan's possessions secured in a specialized transport following behind. Their route deliberately avoided main roads, using secondary paths unlikely to be monitored by Sentinel operatives. There's something I don't understand, Howard said as they traveled. Why was Sullivan's disappearance never properly investigated? Even with classified aspects, a missing soldier should have triggered significant resources. Richardson was silent for a moment, hands steady on the wheel. Different era, Mr. Freeman. Cold War priorities. Sullivan's role made him technically deniable. No official acknowledgement of his counterintelligence activities. Convenient for those who wanted him silenced. Precisely. The initial investigation was cursory, then classified under national security provisions. By the time questions resurfaced in the 1970s, trails were cold, witnesses scattered or deceased. Except Margaret. Richardson nodded. She remained hidden until 1998. Changed her name to Eleanor Williams, lived in Oregon, never remarried. When she died, her personal effects included coded journals that eventually reached my unit through a perceptive archivist. She never came forward with what she knew. Fear is a powerful silencer, Mr. Freeman. She had witnessed her husband's effective disappearance. The journals suggest she believed she was under surveillance for decades, likely correctly. Howard contemplated this legacy of fear, yet she preserved information. In her own way, the journals were heavily coded, appearing as ordinary diaries to casual inspection. Only when properly deciphered did they reveal connections to Sullivan's investigation. She had a daughter, Howard recalled from Walter's revelation. Emily, born 1950, raised as Emily Williams, never told her father's true identity or fate. She passed away in 2017, but her daughter, Sullivan's granddaughter, lives in Portland. Sarah Winters, elementary school teacher, 48 years old. The human connections behind historical events struck Howard profoundly. Sullivan wasn't just a name on decades-old documents, but a husband, father, grandfather, generations affected by secrets buried before they were born. Does she know, Sarah? Some details. After we deciphered Margaret's journals, I made contact, shared what we could without compromising the ongoing investigation. She provided DNA that helped confirm remains we believed might be Sullivan's. They weren't. So his body was never found. Richardson shook his head, another piece of the puzzle still missing. As they approached Howard's property, Richardson instructed the convoy to maintain distance while he conducted a security sweep. The house appeared undisturbed, but both men approached with professional caution. Clear, Richardson confirmed after a methodical check of the interior. But I recommend you not stay here tonight. We can arrange secure accommodations until protective measures are implemented. Howard surveyed his home, the same walls that had once sheltered James and Margaret Sullivan, now temporarily unsafe because of the secrets they had hidden. I'll need some personal items. Of course, pack for several days. My team will remain on site while you're gone. As Howard gathered essentials, he found himself in the bedroom that might once have been Sullivan's. Standing there, he experienced an unexpected connection across time. Two intelligence men, separated by decades but united by commitment to uncomfortable truths. He knew they might kill him, Howard said when Richardson appeared in the doorway, but he created a record anyway. The highest form of service, Richardson agreed, risking everything not for tactical advantage or national pride, but for the principle that truth matters. Howard nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of his age. I never expected to be part of something like this at 76. Some calls to duty come late, Richardson observed, but are no less important for their timing. The secure facility turned out to be a modernized building on a military reservation 30 miles outside the city, unmarked, surrounded by layers of security that suggested significant operations occurred within. Howard was processed with efficiency, provided comfortable but Spartan quarters, and informed that his formal statement would be taken the following morning. Sleep came in fragments, his mind processing the rapid evolution of events. He had begun the week as a retired widower with a curious mound behind his shed. Now he was in a classified facility, involved in what appeared to be the final chapter of a 70-year-old case with national security implications. Morning brought Walter Davis, looking remarkably composed for a man who had been in police custody hours earlier. "You look like hell, Freeman," Walter greeted him, echoing their exchange from the diner. "Been a busy night," Howard replied with the ghost of a smile. "Richardson got you released?" His team made some calls. Amazing how quickly charges can disappear when the right people take interest. Walter lowered himself into a chair, wincing slightly. "Though I might have pulled something during my diversion. Not as spry as I was in Korea. None of us are." They shared a moment of companionable silence, the understanding that passes between men who have seen the darker corners of history and emerged with their humanity intact. "Richardson briefed me on what happened at Westfield," Walter said finally. "Quick thinking with this psychological operation. Lawrence always did overestimate his position." Howard raised an eyebrow. "You know him?" "Crossed paths in the 90s when I was still sheriff. Sentinel Group occasionally intersected with local law enforcement, always politely suggesting we look elsewhere, focus on different leads." "Effective?" "With some, not with me." Walter's expression hardened momentarily. "I recognize their type from our intelligence days. Men who believe they serve a higher purpose that justifies any method, while actually serving themselves," Howard concluded. "Precisely. The original mission, protecting valuable scientists, mutated over decades into protecting reputations, then eventually protecting the protection apparatus itself." Their conversation was interrupted by Richardson's arrival. The colonel appeared remarkably fresh, despite what must have been minimal sleep. "Gentlemen, we're ready for your official statements. After that, we have something you might want to see." The debriefing process was thorough but efficient, conducted by intelligence officers with appropriate clearances. Howard recounted his discovery of the mound, subsequent excavation, and the events that followed. Walter provided context about Sullivan based on their shared service and his independent knowledge of Operation Paperclip's darker aspects. 3 hours later, Richardson led them to a secure conference room where Sullivan's possessions had been carefully arranged on examination tables. Each item had been photographed, cataloged, and partially analyzed by specialists. "We've made significant progress correlating this evidence with our existing files," Richardson explained. "The letters provide names and locations previously unknown to us. The financial records connect directly to funds we'd identified as suspicious but couldn't trace." "What about the weapon?" Howard asked. "Ballistics is preparing comparative analysis with an unsolved shooting from October 1953. Preliminary examination suggests it will match a bullet recovered from a body found near a paperclip facility in Maryland." "The victim?" "Unidentified at the time. We now believe it may have been a Sentinel operative sent to silence Sullivan." Walter leaned forward. "Self-defense?" "Most likely. Based on the reconstructed timeline, Sullivan was ambushed but managed to defend himself. He then buried the evidence and attempted to flee, but was intercepted before he could reach Margaret." The clinical analysis of a man's final days carried emotional weight that transcended the decades since his death. Howard found himself deeply invested in Sullivan's fate, as though the sergeant had entrusted him personally with completing his mission. "There's one more thing you should see," Richardson said, leading them to a separate table where documents lay beneath protective covers. These were found tucked into the lining of Sullivan's uniform jacket. "We nearly missed them." The papers, brittle with age but preserved by their sealed container, contained hand-drawn maps and coordinates. Locations in Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania were marked with precise notations in Sullivan's distinctive handwriting. He identified 3 additional sites, Richardson explained, locations where he believed evidence of Kleinman's activities might be found. "We're preparing search operations now." "After 70 years?" Walter questioned. "Documents endure, especially when properly preserved." Sullivan was methodical. "These locations are specific buildings, particular file rooms." Howard studied the maps, recognizing the precision of intelligence tradecraft. He created redundancy, multiple evidence caches to ensure something survived even if he didn't. "A final act of duty," Richardson agreed, "one we can now complete on his behalf." The weight of this historical continuity, the passing of mission from one generation of intelligence professionals to the next, resonated deeply. Sullivan had launched a message into the uncertain future, and by chance or providence, it had reached those equipped to understand and act upon it. "What happens to Sentinel Group now?" Howard asked. Richardson's expression was carefully measured. "Their operational status is being reviewed at the highest levels. The evidence you discovered provides leverage that didn't previously exist." Meaning? Meaning certain protections are being reconsidered, certain accommodations withdrawn. Walter nodded with grim satisfaction. "About time." "And Sullivan?" Howard pressed. "Will his service be acknowledged?" "That process has already begun," Richardson confirmed. "A posthumous commendation is being prepared, recognizing his courage in uncovering uncomfortable truths at great personal risk." "And his family? His granddaughter?" "Sarah Winters will receive full disclosure of her grandfather's service, consistent with national security requirements. Personal effects will be returned to her as the legal heir." Howard thought of the woman who had never known her grandfather, raised without knowledge of his sacrifice or the forces that had shaped her family's destiny. "I'd like to meet her, if possible." Richardson studied him thoughtfully. "That might be arranged, once security concerns are addressed." The debriefing concluded with logistical details, protective measures for Howard's property, communication protocols, confidentiality requirements. Despite the bureaucratic nature of these arrangements, Howard recognized their importance. Sentinel Group might be facing constraints, but organizations with decades of operation rarely disappeared overnight. As they prepared to leave the secure facility, Richardson took Howard aside for a private word. "You've handled yourself with remarkable composure through all this, Mr. Freeman. Not everyone your age would have demonstrated such resilience or clarity." Howard shrugged modestly. "Intelligence work teaches adaptability. The fundamentals don't change, even when the context does. Nevertheless, you've provided significant service in bringing this matter to resolution. Sullivan would have recognized a kindred spirit in you, I think." The unexpected personal acknowledgement caught Howard off guard. Throughout his career, recognition had been minimal. The nature of intelligence work demanded anonymity, success measured by absence of failure rather than visible achievement. "I just dug up a box, Colonel. Sullivan was the one who risked everything." "Don't underestimate your role," Richardson countered. "You recognize the significance of what you found. You took appropriate security measures. You sought trustworthy assistance rather than authorities who might have buried it again. Those decisions matter." Howard nodded, accepting the assessment with quiet dignity. "What comes next?" "For you, return to normal life, with some additional security. For us, following Sullivan's maps to whatever final evidence he left behind." The truth, Howard reflected as they departed, was that there would be no returning to normal life. When the discovery behind his shed had fundamentally altered his understanding of his property, his country's history, and his own place in the continuity of service. Some knowledge once gained could never be unlearned. Some responsibilities, once accepted, could never be relinquished. James Sullivan had understood this when he created his time capsule of evidence, sending truth forward through decades of silence to reach those who might finally bring it into light. As the secure facility receded in the distance, Howard touched the dog tags he still wore beneath his shirt. Sullivan's identity pressed against his skin like a talisman. The weight of them felt right somehow, a physical reminder that the past is never truly buried, merely waiting for the right moment to emerge. Truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface, no matter how many layers of earth we pile atop it. And sometimes an old man with a shovel becomes the unexpected instrument of its liberation. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Westfield, Howard stood at his kitchen window, watching military specialists methodically scan his property with ground-penetrating radar. The equipment, far more sophisticated than anything available to civilians, moved in precise patterns across his yard, focusing particularly on the area surrounding the shed. Colonel Richardson had explained their purpose, ensuring no additional evidence remained buried. Sullivan had been methodical. The possibility of a second container couldn't be dismissed. The specialists worked with quiet efficiency, their movements reminding Howard of minesweeping operations he'd observed decades earlier. The same careful attention to potentially significant anomalies. Walter arrived as the team completed their final sweep, parking his truck beside the military vehicles. At 74, he still moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to authority, nodding acknowledgement to the soldiers who recognized his former sheriff status. "Find anything interesting?" Walter asked, joining Howard at the window. "Nothing conclusive, some metallic signatures, but likely just old farm equipment or boundary markers." Howard gestured toward the coffee pot. "Fresh brewed." They settled at the kitchen table, the familiar ritual of coffee shared between old soldiers providing comfort amid extraordinary circumstances. Through the window, they could see Colonel Richardson conferring with the technical team, reviewing data on specialized tablets. "How's the security detail?" Walter inquired, nodding toward the unmarked vehicle parked discreetly down the road. "Military personnel maintaining surveillance protection. Professional, unobtrusive." Howard shrugged. "Though it's strange having people watching my property for reasons other than trying to break in." Walter chuckled. "Quite the reversal." "They found something at one of Sullivan's locations," Howard said after a moment, keeping his voice low despite the swept-for-devices status of his home. "Richardson called this morning. A sealed document cache in the sub-basement of a decommissioned research facility in Maryland. Contents? Personnel files, experimental protocols, photographic evidence linking Kleinman directly to concentration camp activities." Howard's expression remained neutral, but his eyes reflected the gravity of these discoveries. "And a list of American officials who approved his recruitment despite knowing his background." Walter let out a low whistle. "Names we'd recognize?" Some, Richardson wouldn't share specifics, but indicated several were prominent in scientific administration during the early Cold War. Most would be long dead by now. "It's not about prosecuting individuals anymore," Howard noted. "It's about historical accuracy, acknowledging what was permitted in the name of national security." Richardson's approach to the house interrupted their conversation. The colonel entered with the brisk efficiency that seemed his natural state, declining coffee with a polite gesture. "Mr. Freeman, Mr. Davis," he acknowledged. "We've completed our survey. No additional containers detected, though we did locate what appears to be an old septic tank from the property's original construction." "Results from Maryland?" Walter prompted. Richardson's expression shifted subtly. Professional satisfaction tempered by the sobering nature of their discoveries. "Comprehensive. Sullivan documented everything meticulously. Names, dates, photographic evidence, cross-referenced against captured German records." "Will it be made public?" Howard asked the question that had been lingering since their first confrontation with Sentinel Group. "A redacted version will be released to appropriate historical archives," Richardson confirmed. "Certain operational details and names of minor participants will remain classified, but the essential facts, including Kleinman's activities and the knowledge of his recruiters, will become part of the historical record." And Sentinel Group? "Their funding has been significantly constrained. Several former intelligence officials associated with them have been called to account for unauthorized operations." Richardson allowed himself a thin smile. "Your home is no longer under surveillance, except by my people." The technical team began packing their equipment, the systematic efficiency of their movements reflecting rigorous training. Howard watched them through the window, contemplating how different his life had become in mere weeks. His quiet retirement had transformed into the final chapter of a decades-old intelligence operation, one that would likely appear in classified histories yet to be written. "There's another matter we should discuss," Richardson said, placing a folder on the kitchen table. "Sarah Winters, Sullivan's granddaughter, has expressed interest in meeting you." Howard's attention snapped back to the conversation. "She knows about my involvement?" "Limited details. That you discovered evidence her grandfather left behind, which has contributed to recognition of his service." Richardson opened the folder, revealing a photograph of a woman in her late 40s, intelligent eyes, Sullivan's determined jawline visible despite the generational distance. "She's scheduled to receive her grandfather's effects next week in a small ceremony. She asked specifically if you would attend." Howard studied the photograph, experiencing an unexpected connection to this woman who carried Sullivan's bloodline. "Of course, I'd be honored. The ceremony will be private, family, select military personnel, appropriate historical representatives. In Portland, where she lives." "I haven't traveled in years," Howard noted. though not as refusal. All arrangements would be handled, Richardson assured him. Military transport, appropriate accommodations. Walter, who had been observing silently, interjected. You should go, Howard. Complete the circle. The concept resonated. Howard had begun this journey by uncovering Sullivan's legacy. Seeing it restored to his family offered proper closure. I'll need my good suit pressed. Richardson nodded, satisfied. There's one more item. He reached into his briefcase, extracting a small velvet box which he placed before Howard. The Secretary of the Army has authorized this. Inside lay a civilian medal Howard recognized immediately. The Distinguished Public Service Award, the highest honor the Army could bestow on a civilian. The accompanying citation acknowledged exceptional service in bringing to light historical truths of significant national importance. Howard stared at the medal, momentarily speechless. His career in intelligence had been conducted in shadows, acknowledgments coming in the form of quiet nods from superiors rather than public recognition. This tangible symbol of appreciation felt almost discordant. I just dug up a box in my yard, he said finally. You did considerably more than that, Richardson countered. You recognized the significance of what you found, secured it appropriately, and navigated a complex situation with skill that would honor operatives half your age. Walter reached over, clasping Howard's shoulder. Accept it, old friend, and for all the recognition neither of us received when it mattered. Howard closed the box carefully. When will the ceremony take place? Next Thursday. We'll depart Wednesday morning. After Richardson left, Howard and Walter remained at the kitchen table contemplating the unexpected turns their lives had taken. The technical team completed their work, the military vehicles departing with the same quiet efficiency with which they had arrived. The property returned to apparent normalcy, though both men knew nothing would ever be quite the same. Will you wear Sullivan's dog tags to the ceremony? Walter asked, having noticed the chain around Howard's neck. Howard touched the metal discs beneath his shirt. Seems appropriate, a connection between his beginning and ending. Poetic for an intelligence man. Age brings perspective. Howard gazed out the window toward the shed and the now-filled excavation site. Sometimes I wonder if he chose that spot deliberately, knowing the mound would eventually become noticeable, draw attention. You think he anticipated being discovered? Not specifically, but he created conditions that improved the probability. Howard sipped his cooling coffee. In intelligence, sometimes the best you can do is set events in motion, then trust the right people will recognize their significance when the time comes. Like a message in a bottle, Walter mused, cast into uncertain waters. Exactly. Sullivan couldn't know who might find his evidence, or when, but he trusted someone would and would understand its importance. The conversation drifted to practical matters, travel arrangements, security considerations, appropriate protocol for the upcoming ceremony. Yet beneath these logistical details lay deeper currents of understanding between two men who had spent their lives navigating classified worlds. They recognized in Sullivan's actions the ultimate expression of their shared professional ethos, the patient preservation of truth against forces that would suppress it. The military transport to Portland was a small executive jet, its interior more functional than luxurious, but considerably more comfortable than the military flights Howard remembered from his service days. Richardson accompanied him, using the journey to provide additional context about Sullivan's case and what Howard might expect at the ceremony. Sarah Winters has been remarkably composed throughout this process, the colonel explained. She's an elementary school teacher, 5th grade mathematics. Married, 2 teenage children who will also attend the ceremony. Sullivan's great-grandchildren, Howard noted, the generational connection striking him profoundly. Have they been told the full story? Age-appropriate versions. The 16-year-old has received more details than the 14-year-old. How has Sarah responded to learning her grandfather was essentially eliminated by his own government? Richardson's expression tightened slightly, with remarkable grace. She understands the historical context, the Cold War imperatives, the different ethical frameworks of that era. She seems focused on vindication rather than retribution. A healthy perspective, Howard observed. Revenge offers little comfort after 70 years. Indeed, though I believe the recognition of her grandfather's courage provides significant consolation. The ceremony took place in a small auditorium at the Portland Federal Building, intimate enough for personal connection, but official enough to convey appropriate gravitas. Military personnel in dress uniforms stood at dignified attention. Representatives from historical archives and veterans organizations occupied reserved seating. At the center of the front row sat Sarah Winters, her husband, and their two children, Sullivan's living legacy. Howard was seated directly behind them, Walter beside him, both men wearing their best suits with military precision. A display case near the podium contained Sullivan's effects. The uniform, photographs, medals, and personal items, carefully preserved and respectfully arranged. Notably absent were the more sensitive materials, the weapon, the money, the documents directly related to Operation Paperclip. Those remained secured in government archives, their historical significance acknowledged, but their contents still subject to classification protocols. A senior Army official presided, his remarks balancing historical acknowledgement with appropriate discretion regarding still sensitive aspects of Sullivan's service. The language was carefully calibrated, recognizing exceptional courage in documenting matters of significant historical and ethical importance, without explicitly detailing the paperclip connections that remained partially classified. When Sarah Winters was invited to speak, Howard was struck by her composure. In her late 40s, she carried herself with quiet dignity that reminded him of photographs he'd seen of Margaret Sullivan. "My grandfather was a stranger to me," she began, her voice steady. "Growing up as Emily Williams' daughter, I knew only that my grandfather had died before I was born. My grandmother spoke of him rarely, and always with a sadness that discouraged questions." She glanced at the display case containing Sullivan's effects. "I never imagined he had lived a life of such consequence, that his courage would one day be recognized in a ceremony like this. Learning about him has been like discovering a missing piece of my own identity, explaining patterns of belief and behavior that have shaped our family across generations." Howard listened intently, recognizing in her words the profound impact of secrets across time, how Sullivan's actions and subsequent disappearance had created ripples affecting individuals not yet born when he made his fateful decisions. "I'm grateful to those who preserved his story," Sarah continued, "the officials who maintained the investigation across decades, and especially Mr. Howard Freeman, whose discovery on his property finally brought my grandfather's courage to light." Howard felt eyes turned toward him, uncomfortable with attention, yet understanding its appropriateness in this context. He nodded respectfully to Sarah, acknowledging the connection between them, two strangers linked by buried secrets and moral choices made long ago. The ceremony concluded with the formal presentation of a posthumously awarded Distinguished Service Cross to Sarah, recognition of Sullivan's extraordinary courage under circumstances now partially declassified. The medal gleamed under the auditorium lights, a tangible symbol of vindication 7 decades delayed. Afterwards, during the small reception, Sarah approached Howard directly. Up close, the resemblance to the photographs he'd seen of James Sullivan was more pronounced. Something in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze. "Mr. Freeman," she acknowledged, extending her hand, "I've been hoping to thank you personally." Howard clasped her hand, feeling the strange weight of historical connection. "I only found what your grandfather intended someone to discover. He's the one who deserves recognition. Nevertheless, you made choices too. You could have ignored what you found or turned it over to authorities who might have buried it again." Her perceptiveness reminded Howard that intelligence aptitude sometimes ran in families. "My grandfather trusted that someday someone would understand the significance of his evidence. You were that person." They moved to a quieter corner of the reception, joined by Sarah's husband Michael and Colonel Richardson. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, the initial formality giving way to more personal exchanges. Sarah shared stories passed down from her grandmother, details of family life that had been shaped by secrets and absence. "My grandmother lived in constant vigilance," she explained, "always checking locks, varying her routines, watching for surveillance. I thought it was age-related paranoia. Now I understand. She lived with the knowledge of what had happened to my grandfather." "She protected you by keeping you uninformed," Howard observed. "Yes, a burden she carried alone for decades." Sarah's expression reflected complex emotions, grief for her grandmother's solitary struggle, admiration for her strength. She kept a coded journal I never understood until Colonel Richardson's team helped decrypt it. Even in her most private writings, she maintained operational security. Richardson interjected gently. Your grandmother was OSS trained. Those habits become ingrained. Was anything recovered from the Maryland location about her? Howard asked. About what happened after Sullivan disappeared? Some documentation, Richardson confirmed. Surveillance reports monitoring her for several years after his disappearance. Recommendations against direct intervention once she established her new identity. They watched her, but left her alone, Sarah translated, a hint of bitterness edging her voice. Different era, Richardson reminded her gently. Cold War priorities. The conversation shifted to the future, how Sullivan's story would be preserved, what aspects would eventually be declassified, how his service would be incorporated into historical understanding of Operation Paperclip's complexities. There will be a small exhibition at the National Archives next year, Richardson explained, focused on ethical challenges in intelligence operations, with Sullivan as a case study in moral courage. Will you attend, Mr. Freeman? Sarah asked. If health permits, Howard replied, conscious of his 76 years, though I prefer to remain in the background of this story. Like my grandfather, you seem comfortable with others receiving credit for your contributions, she observed perceptively. The reception concluded with the formal transfer of Sullivan's personal effects to Sarah, the uniform, photographs, medals, and letters deemed appropriate for family possession. Howard watched as she accepted the items with reverent hands, these artifacts connecting her to the grandfather she had never known. As they prepared to depart, Sarah approached Howard one final time, holding a small package. My grandfather's dog tags were not among the items in the container you found, she said. But Colonel Richardson mentioned you've been wearing a set that belonged to him. From another source? Howard hesitated, his hand moving instinctively to his chest where Sullivan's tags rested beneath his shirt. From Walter Davis's collection, he confirmed. The necessary misdirection coming naturally even in this context. He had acquired them years ago through military channels. She extended the package. Then I'd like you to have these. They belong to my grandmother, her OSS identification. She kept them hidden her entire life, even from me. They were discovered among her effects after she passed. Howard accepted the package with appropriate solemnity, understanding the significance of this exchange, a symbolic connection between those who had preserved truth across generations. Thank you, he said simply. I'll keep them with your grandfathers. The flight back to Oak Ridge provided time for reflection. Howard sat by the window, watching clouds pass beneath the military transport, contemplating the extraordinary convergence of lives and choices that had brought him to this moment. Satisfactory outcome? Richardson asked from the adjacent seat. As much as possible after 70 years, Howard replied, though I suspect parts of this story will remain classified long after we're gone. Some aspects, yes, particularly those involving still sensitive relationships with Germany. But Sullivan's courage will be recognized, the historical record corrected where possible. Howard nodded, his thoughts turning to the more personal dimensions of the case. Sarah seems to have found some peace in knowing the truth. Truth has healing properties, even when painful, Richardson observed. The human mind struggles more with uncertainty than with difficult facts. An intelligence professional advocating for disclosure, Howard noted with mild amusement. Times have changed. Contexts change, principles endure. Richardson's expression remained professional, but a hint of philosophical depth showed through. We classify information to protect sources, methods, and national security, not to shield institutions from accountability. The remainder of the flight passed in companionable silence, each man occupied with his own thoughts. Howard contemplated the strange symmetry of his life, beginning in military intelligence and now, in its final chapters, returning to those roots through Sullivan's legacy. When they landed, Walter was waiting at the small military airfield, his truck parked near the tarmac. The three men drove back to Howard's property in contemplative quiet, the landscape passing in familiar patterns that somehow looked different after all that had transpired. At Howard's house, Richardson declined an invitation to stay for dinner, citing operational responsibilities. Before departing, he provided final updates on the Sullivan investigation. The Maryland documents are being integrated into our historical assessment. The Virginia location yielded additional photographic evidence. Pennsylvania remains to be examined, but preliminary surveys indicate preserved materials. Sullivan was thorough, Walter observed. Impressively so. He created a comprehensive documentation system distributed across multiple locations, classic intelligence tradecraft applied to internal whistleblowing. After Richardson's departure, Howard and Walter settled on the porch, watching evening shadows lengthen across the yard. The excavation site where the mound had been was now indistinguishable from the surrounding ground, filled, leveled, and beginning to show new grass growth. "You're thinking of planting something there," Walter observed, noting Howard's contemplative gaze. "Seems appropriate, a marker of sorts. Not too obvious, I hope. Wouldn't want to create another curiosity for whoever owns this place after you." Howard chuckled. "Nothing suspicious, just wildflowers perhaps, something that returns year after year." They sat in comfortable silence, two old intelligence professionals watching darkness gather, appreciating the uncomplicated peace that followed mission completion. After decades in a profession where outcomes often remained ambiguous, the Sullivan case offered rare clarity. A secret revealed, truth acknowledged, justice of a sort achieved. "What will you do with the medal?" Walter asked eventually, referring to the Distinguished Public Service Award Howard had received. "Store it away, most likely. Never been one for displaying such things." "Sarah seemed impressed by you." "By what I represent in her grandfather's story," Howard corrected. "The completion of his mission, essentially." Walter nodded, understanding this distinction. "Will you stay in touch with her?" "Perhaps. She mentioned wanting to visit when her children's school schedules permit, see where her grandfather lived, where his evidence was buried." "Full circle," Walter observed. Indeed. As night settled fully over the property, Howard reflected on the strange intersection of choice and chance that had led him to this moment. Had the mound been less noticeable? Had he chosen not to investigate? Had he responded differently to its contents? Sullivan's evidence might have remained buried indefinitely, his courage unacknowledged, his family forever unaware of his true legacy. Instead, an old intelligence officer with a shovel had completed a mission decades in the making, bringing truth from darkness into light. Not through dramatic heroics or specialized skills, but through simple recognition of responsibility when confronted with buried secrets. Some truths rest beneath the surface for years, gathering strength in silence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes, by design or providence, they find exactly the person equipped to understand their significance, to recognize that certain secrets deserve preservation not through continued burial, but through careful exhumation and proper acknowledgement. Howard touched the dog tags beneath his shirt, Sullivan's and now Margaret's as well, feeling their weight as both burden and privilege. The truth had found him, and he had proven worthy of its trust. In the intelligence world, perhaps that was the highest commendation one could receive. The earth remembers what men try to forget. But sometimes, if we're fortunate, it delivers its secrets to those who will honor them appropriately, ensuring that courage is ultimately recognized and sacrifice eventually understood, even if decades must pass before the full story can be told. Spring arrived with methodical patience, transforming Howard's property from winter stillness to vibrant renewal. The wildflower seeds he had planted where the mound once stood now pushed through the soil, tentative green shoots promising eventual blossoms of purple, yellow, and white. Howard tended them carefully, enjoying the symbolism of new life emerging from a place that had held secrets for so long. 6 months had passed since the Portland ceremony. The official investigation into Sullivan's evidence had progressed with the deliberate thoroughness characteristic of government processes. Howard received occasional updates from Colonel Richardson, always by secure means, always carefully worded. The Virginia and Pennsylvania locations had yielded additional materials, completing Sullivan's distributed documentation system. Historical archives were being prepared. Certain records were being declassified through carefully managed channels. The Sentinel Group had not disappeared entirely. Organizations with deep roots rarely do, but their operational capabilities had been significantly constrained. Several former members faced administrative reviews for unauthorized activities. Others had quietly retired, understanding that changing political winds no longer favored their particular approach to historical management. Howard's life had largely returned to its previous rhythms, though with subtle differences. The security detail had been withdrawn after 3 months, deemed unnecessary as interest in Sullivan's case shifted from operational to historical. Walter visited more frequently than before, their shared experience having deepened a friendship previously defined by respectful distance. They rarely discussed Sullivan directly anymore, but his presence lingered in their conversations like a silent third participant. On a particularly fine April morning, Howard was pruning branches near the shed when Walter's truck appeared on the gravel drive. His friend emerged carrying a cardboard box and wearing an expression Howard immediately recognized from their intelligence days, the carefully neutral look that preceded significant information. "Beautiful day for gardening," Walter observed casually, setting the box on a nearby bench. "Perfect temperature," Howard agreed, following the established pattern of beginning sensitive conversations with mundane observations. "Coffee's fresh inside." They settled at the kitchen table, mugs steaming between them, the box positioned conspicuously at Walter's elbow. Years of professional communication allowed them to recognize the rhythms of disclosure. The approach to sensitive subjects required proper pacing. "Richardson called yesterday," Walter began. "Pennsylvania site has been fully processed. Final reports are being compiled." Howard nodded. "Closure approaching and then?" "For the official investigation, yes." Walter tapped the box lightly. "But there's a personal element that's emerged." Howard raised an eyebrow, invitation for elaboration. "You remember I mentioned serving with Sullivan briefly in 1950? At Fort Meade, you said, before his paperclip assignment." Walter nodded. "We weren't close friends, but we shared quarters for several months during specialized training. Sullivan mentioned once that he had a system. If anything happened to him, certain personal items would be separated from operational materials." Howard's interest sharpened. "A contingency plan." "Precisely. Military intelligence taught us to prepare for all eventualities." Walter patted the box. "This arrived yesterday from Richardson. Items recovered from the Pennsylvania location that are deemed personal rather than operational, not relevant to the official investigation, but potentially meaningful to Sullivan's family." "And Richardson sent them to you rather than directly to Sarah?" "With her knowledge and consent." Walter's expression softened slightly. "She asked that I review them first, then bring them to you. She'd like your perspective before they're forwarded to her." Howard considered this request, understanding its deeper implications. In the months since the ceremony, he had exchanged several letters with Sarah Winters, respectful, thoughtful correspondence about her grandfather, her grandmother's experiences, the complex legacy they had created. A connection had formed between them, based on shared understanding of Sullivan's sacrifice and Howard's role in bringing it to light. "She trusts your judgment," Walter added, as someone who not only found her grandfather's evidence but understood its significance immediately. Howard nodded, accepting this responsibility. "What's in the box?" Walter opened it carefully, revealing contents organized with military precision, items nested in acid-free tissue, labeled with archival tags. Personal photographs, letters between James and Margaret from before their marriage, a journal from his early Army days, his original Silver Star citation. Walter lifted a small velvet pouch. "And this, which Richardson thought might be particularly relevant to you." The pouch contained a simple brass key attached to a small metal tag stamped with numbers. Howard examined it carefully, professionalism automatically noting details. The key's worn teeth suggesting frequent use, the tag's stamping style consistent with 1940s manufacturing. "Safe deposit box," he concluded. "These numbers would be the account reference." That was Richardson's assessment as well, but here's where it gets interesting. Walter extracted a folded paper from his pocket. This was with the key, instructions for accessing the box, including the location of the bank. Howard examined the paper, Sullivan's handwriting, the same precise script he had seen in the letters from the buried container. The instructions were clear. Citizens National Bank, Oak Ridge Branch, Box 1472. A local bank, Howard observed, the significance immediately apparent. Sullivan maintained a safe deposit box here, separate from his other evidence caches. A box that, as far as we know, has never been accessed since his disappearance, Walter confirmed. Richardson checked the records. The bank changed ownership 3 times since 1953. but their records show the annual fees for Box 1372 have been paid continuously through an attorney's office in Charleston. The arrangement specified maintenance in perpetuity with no access authorization. Howard considered the implications. Sullivan created a time capsule with no planned retrieval date. Until now, Walter's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes conveyed the significance. Richardson has secured authorization for you to access the box, if you're willing. As the person who discovered Sullivan's primary evidence, there's a certain symmetry to you completing this final recovery. Howard studied the key, feeling its weight both physical and symbolic. Sullivan had created multiple evidence caches, the buried container on his property, the 3 locations documented in his maps, and now this safe deposit box maintained for 70 years without access. Each represented a different aspect of his legacy, different intentions for preservation and discovery. Does Sarah know about the key? Yes, Richardson informed her immediately. She specifically requested that you be the one to open the box with her permission. Howard nodded, decision made. When? The bank has been notified. We can go this afternoon. The Citizens National Bank had become Oak Ridge Community Trust, then Piedmont Financial, and finally Eastern Regional Bank through successive mergers. The building retained elements of its 1940s architecture. Marble columns flanking the entrance, high ceilings with ornate molding, the solid construction that characterized institutions of that era. Howard and Walter were met by the branch manager, a professional woman in her 50s, who had clearly been briefed about the unusual nature of their visit. Colonel Richardson had arranged all necessary authorizations, smoothing bureaucratic processes that might otherwise have proven challenging. Box 1372 is in our original vault, she explained, leading them through the bank. It's one of our oldest continuously maintained boxes. I've been manager here for 12 years, and it's never been accessed during my tenure. The vault itself was a study in evolving security technology, original mechanical locks supplemented by modern electronic systems, the heavy door a reminder of an era when physical security was paramount. Inside, rows of metal boxes line the walls, their numbered faceplates polished by decades of maintenance. Box 1372 was located near the bottom row. Larger than standard size, suggesting Sullivan had paid premium rates for additional capacity. The manager used her master key in conjunction with Howard's brass key, the mechanism turning with surprising smoothness after 7 decades. I'll leave you gentlemen to your privacy, she said, withdrawing the metal container and placing it on the center table. Please ring when you're finished. When they were alone, Howard and Walter exchanged glances, 2 intelligence professionals about to access information untouched since the early Cold War. Howard opened the box with deliberate care, aware of the historical significance of this moment. Inside lay several items, each wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well despite the passage of time. A bound leather journal, a small wooden box, a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whoever finds the truth." Howard removed each item carefully, placing them on the table with the reverence appropriate to historical artifacts. The journal, when unwrapped, revealed Sullivan's name embossed on the cover, the pages filled with his distinctive handwriting. Personal rather than operational, Walter observed, glancing at the open pages. Family history, reflections, philosophical thoughts. The wooden box contained photographs. Sullivan with Margaret in happier times, family groupings, moments from his early military career. Unlike the evidence in his other caches, these items represented the personal dimension of the man behind the historical figure, the human context for his professional actions. Howard turned his attention to the sealed envelope, its paper yellowed but intact, the adhesive still holding after decades. With careful precision, he opened it, extracting several handwritten pages. "It's addressed to his descendants," Howard noted, scanning the opening lines. He anticipated his evidence might eventually be discovered, his actions understood. Walter leaned forward slightly. "May I?" Howard passed him the letter, watching his friend's expression as he read Sullivan's final communication. Words written with the expectation they might never be read, yet preserved with the hope they someday would be. "Remarkable foresight," Walter said finally. He understood exactly how his actions would be perceived in different historical contexts. Howard nodded, having glimpsed enough to recognize Sullivan's awareness of how future generations might judge the moral complexities of his era. The letter contained no operational details. Those had been distributed across his evidence caches, but rather the personal reasoning behind his decisions, the ethical framework that had guided his actions. "This belongs to Sarah," Howard said definitively, "the personal testimony behind the official evidence." "Agreed. Richardson will need to review it for security considerations, but I anticipate no objections to releasing it to the family." They carefully documented the contents, photographing each item for official records before rewrapping them in fresh archival materials provided by Richardson's team. The bank manager returned to secure the box. It would remain sealed until formal transfer procedures were completed. The contents officially released to Sullivan's granddaughter. Outside, the spring afternoon had progressed toward evening, long shadows stretching across the town square. Howard and Walter walked in companionable silence, each processing the significance of what they had witnessed. Sullivan understood he was creating a historical record, Howard observed finally. Not just evidence of specific wrongdoing, but context for understanding the moral compromises of his era. He was thinking beyond his own vindication, Walter agreed, providing perspective for future generations who would judge without having experienced the pressures of that time. A historian as much as a whistleblower. The best intelligence officers often are. We document reality without illusions, then preserve that documentation for when it can be properly understood. They returned to Howard's property as sunset painted the western sky in shades of amber and gold. Sitting on the porch, they continued their conversation, exploring the philosophical dimensions of Sullivan's actions and their own roles in bringing his legacy to light. "I've been thinking about the mound," Howard said, gesturing toward the now level ground where wildflower shoots were emerging, "about why Sullivan buried the container in that specific location. Convenience? Accessibility? Perhaps, but I think there's more to it." Howard considered his words carefully. He positioned it where geological processes would eventually reveal it, where the container would gradually rise toward the surface through natural movements of the soil, creating inevitability rather than leaving discovery to chance. Walter nodded thoughtfully. Intelligence methodology applied to posthumous disclosure. He couldn't know who would find it or when, but he created conditions that maximized the probability it would eventually be found, rather than remaining buried forever. The philosophical implications resonated between them. The patient confidence that truth, properly preserved, would eventually find its audience. Sullivan had not simply hidden evidence. He had launched it into the future with calculated trajectories, trusting that time itself would complete his mission. 3 weeks later, Sarah Winters arrived in Oak Ridge with her husband and children. Howard had invited them to stay at his home, an offer accepted with appreciation. The house that had once belonged to James and Margaret Sullivan would briefly shelter their descendants, completing a circle spanning 3 generations. Sarah had received the contents of the safe deposit box the previous week, after security review confirmed no classified material was included. Her first evening in Howard's home was spent at the kitchen table. The family photographs from the box spread before her. Sullivan's journal opened to passages she found particularly meaningful. "I never imagined having this connection to him," she said, looking up from a photograph of her grandfather in his army uniform. "For most of my life, he was just an absence, a name rarely mentioned, a subject that made my grandmother sad." Howard nodded, understanding the complex emotions involved in discovering family history long concealed. "His letter to you, to his descendants, it provides context the official records never could. Yes, he explains his choices, his values, why he felt compelled to document what he discovered despite the risks." Sarah touched the journal reverently. "He was worried about how history would judge him, not for his whistleblowing, but for his participation in a system that made moral compromises." Howard considered this dimension of Sullivan's character, the self-awareness that had led him to preserve not only evidence of wrongdoing, but his personal reasoning, his ethical struggles. "He wanted you to understand he was a product of his time, making difficult choices with limited information," Howard observed, while still maintaining core principles about what was fundamentally right. The following day, Howard showed the family his property, including the area where the mound had once stood. The wildflowers were beginning to bloom, early varieties adding splashes of color to the previously unremarkable ground. "This is where you found his evidence?" Sarah's 16-year-old son asked, studying the area with the intense curiosity of adolescence. Right here, Howard confirmed, a mound about this high. He held his hand at knee level. It had grown over the decades as the container gradually worked its way upward. Like it wanted to be found, the boy observed with unexpected insight. Perhaps it did, Howard agreed, impressed by the perception. Your great-grandfather was very methodical. I believe he positioned it where natural soil processes would eventually reveal it. Sarah knelt beside the emerging wildflowers, touching the small green shoots gently. What made you decide to plant these here? Seemed appropriate. New life emerging where truth was buried. Different colors representing different aspects of your grandfather's legacy. Courage, perseverance, hope that justice would eventually prevail. She nodded, understanding the symbolism. A living memorial, more meaningful than stone. They continued the property tour, Howard showing them the shed where he had first opened Sullivan's container, the kitchen where he had analyzed the contents, the living room where he had confronted the false federal agent. The technical details of the case had been shared with appropriate security considerations, allowing Sarah and her family to understand the significance of Howard's discovery without compromising still classified aspects. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades reminiscent of the day Howard had accessed Sullivan's safe deposit box, the family gathered on the porch. Sarah's husband grilled steaks on Howard's rarely used barbecue. The teenagers engaged Walter in surprisingly perceptive questions about intelligence work, appropriately sanitized answers providing glimpses into a profession built on discretion and patient analysis. Howard observed the scene with quiet satisfaction, his solitary home temporarily transformed by the presence of Sullivan's descendants. There was healing in this gathering, a sense of completion that transcended the official resolution of the case. Later, when the teenagers had retreated inside to charge depleted phone batteries, Sarah joined Howard at the far end of the porch. She carried a small package wrapped in simple blue paper. I brought something for you, she said, presenting it with a formal gesture that acknowledged its significance. Something I think my grandfather would want you to have. Howard accepted the package with appropriate reverence, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a silver pocket watch. The case was engraved with Sullivan's initials, the mechanism inside still functional after decades. It was in his personal effects that my grandmother preserved, Sarah explained. She kept it wound regularly until her death, though she never explained its significance to me. Howard held the watch carefully, feeling its weight, the physical connection to Sullivan more immediate than the dog tags he still wore beneath his shirt. According to his journal, it was awarded for his service in Europe during the war, Sarah continued, given to him by his commanding officer after a particularly difficult operation. This should remain with your family, Howard protested gently, an heirloom for your children. We have his journals, his photographs, his letters, the personal legacy that defines who he was. Sarah's expression conveyed determined certainty. But this watch represents his service, his commitment to duty above self. You embody those same qualities. You completed his mission when no one else could. He would want you to have it. Howard recognized the gesture could not be declined without causing offense. I'm honored, he said simply, the emotion genuine despite his customary reserve. There's something else, Sarah added, her voice quieter. When Colonel Richardson's team processed the Pennsylvania location, they found documentation suggesting my grandfather wasn't killed immediately after his disappearance. Howard's attention sharpened. Evidence he survived? For approximately 6 months. Sentinel Group records indicate he was held at a private facility while they attempted to determine what evidence he had hidden and where. Her voice remained steady, though the subject matter was undoubtedly painful. They eventually determined he wouldn't break, despite significant pressures. The euphemism for torture hung between them, acknowledged without requiring explicit statement. I'm sorry, Howard said, the inadequacy of the words evident but the sentiment genuine. His final act was to create these distributed evidence caches, Sarah continued. Knowing he likely wouldn't survive to reveal what he had discovered, he ensured the truth would eventually emerge through other means. Howard nodded, professional understanding mixing with personal respect. The highest form of service, continuing the mission even when personal survival is no longer possible. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching darkness settle over the property that connected them across time. The wildflowers were barely visible now, but Howard knew they would continue growing, eventually creating a living memorial where Sullivan's evidence had been buried. The following morning brought unexpected news. Colonel Richardson arrived early, his official vehicle pulling into Howard's driveway just as Sarah's family was preparing breakfast. The colonel's expression carried the carefully modulated neutrality that intelligence professionals recognize as preceding significant information. "I apologize for the intrusion," Richardson said after exchanging greetings with everyone. "But there's been a development I thought you should hear in person." They gathered in Howard's living room, the teenagers sensing the shift in atmosphere and abandoning their usual digital distractions. "The final site, the Pennsylvania location, contained more than we initially reported," Richardson began, his tone measured. "Among the documents was a detailed report prepared by Margaret Sullivan after her husband's disappearance. She had maintained her own intelligence network, leveraging OSS contacts who remained sympathetic to her situation." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "My grandmother was investigating my grandfather's disappearance?" "Precisely, and quite effectively, despite limited resources and considerable personal risk." Richardson's professional demeanor softened slightly. "She identified the facility where he was held, documented the individuals involved, and even managed to infiltrate a cleaning staff member who confirmed his presence." "Did she attempt rescue to yeah?" Howard asked, the intelligence officer in him automatically assessing operational implications. "She considered it, according to her notes, but recognized the probability of success was minimal, while the risk to herself and by extension to your mother, who was 3 years old at the time, was substantial." Sarah nodded, understanding the impossible calculation her grandmother had faced. "So she documented everything instead." "With remarkable thoroughness. Names, dates, locations, organizational structures. She created a comprehensive record of Sentinel's early operations and their connection to official channels." Walter, who had been listening silently, interjected. "This would have been extraordinary intelligence work even for a trained operative with institutional support. For a woman operating alone in the early 1950s, exceptional," and Richardson agreed. "She understood she couldn't save her husband, but she could ensure those responsible would eventually face historical judgment." The parallel with Sullivan's own actions hung in the air. Two intelligence professionals, husband and wife, separately creating distributed evidence systems to ensure truth would survive, even if they did not. "There's more," Richardson continued after a moment. "Margaret's documentation included specific details about Sullivan's final months. He knew he wouldn't survive, but used his captivity to feed Sentinel deliberately misleading information about his evidence caches." Howard nodded with professional appreciation. "Counterintelligence from a position of extreme vulnerability. Impressive." "He sent them searching in the wrong locations, buying time for his actual evidence to remain secure," Richardson confirmed. "According to Margaret's notes, his final act of defiance was telling his captors that the most damning evidence was buried where it would rise to the surface when the time was right." Howard and Walter exchanged glances, the significance immediately apparent. "He was referring to the container on this property," Howard said, "the one I found." "The mound," Sarah's son interjected, the teenager's quick mind connecting the elements. "He knew it would gradually rise to the surface." "Exactly," Richardson nodded. Sullivan's final message, delivered to his captors as misdirection, but containing literal truth they couldn't recognize, became his epitaph. The evidence did rise to the surface, just as he predicted, though it took 70 years and required Mr. Freeman's particular set of skills to recognize its significance. The weight of this historical continuity settled over the room. The deliberate actions of two people 70 years earlier, finding completion through individuals who hadn't been born when the evidence was hidden. The circular nature of the narrative provided a sense of justice that transcended conventional legal remedies, offering instead the satisfaction of truth, finally emerging into light. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. "Margaret's documentation will be incorporated into the historical record, with appropriate security reviews," Richardson explained. "Her role in this case will be formally acknowledged alongside her husband's. And," he hesitated briefly, "we now have sufficient evidence to identify Sullivan's remains." The shift in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. "You found him?" Sarah's voice remained steady, though her hands tightened around her coffee mug. Sentinel's records included the location of a private cemetery in western Maryland. Using Margaret's documentation, we've identified a grave marked only with a number that corresponds to Sullivan's captivity records. DNA testing is being arranged to confirm, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. The news brought both closure and renewed grief, the confirmation of death long assumed but never certain. Sarah reached for her husband's hand, the teenagers moving instinctively closer to their parents, family bonds strengthening against historical darkness. If confirmed, would reinterment be possible? Howard asked, voicing the practical question others might hesitate to raise. With appropriate military honors? Absolutely, Richardson confirmed. All arrangements would be handled through official channels, with full honors appropriate to his service and sacrifice. The conversation continued, exploring logistical details and emotional implications. Throughout, Howard observed the remarkable resilience of Sullivan's descendants, their ability to absorb painful historical truths while finding meaning in the courage that had preserved them. 3 generations removed from the events, they were nonetheless shaped by decisions made before their birth, by secrets preserved for eventual discovery. That afternoon, as Sarah's family prepared for departure, Howard took a final walk with them to the wildflower patch. The blooms were more numerous now, creating patches of color against the earth that had once concealed Sullivan's evidence. "We'll return for the reinterment," Sarah said, kneeling to touch the flowers gently. "And again when these are in full bloom. The property will always be open to you," Howard assured her. "This place connects us all now." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah's son lingered, waiting until the others were slightly ahead before speaking to Howard directly. "Do you think he knew?" the boy asked, his expression thoughtful beyond his 16 years. "When he buried that box, do you think my great-grandfather knew it would be you who found it?" Howard considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not me specifically, but I believe he trusted that whoever found it would recognize its importance, would have the background to understand what he was trying to preserve. Like it was waiting for the right person." The teenager nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "Time finding the right connection." "Perhaps that's exactly what happened," Howard agreed, impressed by the insight. "Truth finding its appropriate messenger." After the family's departure, Howard and Walter remained on the porch, watching evening shadows lengthen across the property. Richardson had left earlier, returning to the operational demands of concluding the Sullivan case. The house felt different somehow, the transient presence of Sullivan's descendants having altered its emotional topography in subtle but permanent ways. "Full circle," Walter observed, "not for the first time." "As complete as possible after 70 years, Howard agreed, fingering the silver watch now residing in his pocket. Sullivan couldn't have anticipated how his evidence would eventually emerge, yet he created conditions that maximized the probability of discovery. "Intelligence methodology applied to posthumous disclosure," Walter nodded. "He couldn't control who would find it or when, but he ensured it would eventually be found." "And Margaret created her own parallel system of documentation," Howard added, "each of them preserving truth through different methods, neither knowing if their efforts would succeed. Yet both ultimately vindicated," Walter concluded, though decades too late for personal justice. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled, each contemplating the strange intersection of choice and chance that had connected them to Sullivan's legacy. Howard reflected on the improbabilities involved, that he would purchase this specific property, notice the mound's peculiarities, possess the precise background to recognize the significance of its contents. Coincidence seemed insufficient explanation. Pattern felt more appropriate. "Some truths are patient," Howard said finally. "They wait beneath the surface, gathering strength while falsehoods weaken with time." Walter nodded, understanding the philosophical dimension of their shared experience. The longer truth remains buried, the more power it accumulates. Like a spring compressed beyond its limits, when it finally releases, the force can be devastating. Howard's gaze drifted to the wildflower patch, barely visible now in the gathering darkness, but present nonetheless, growing steadily toward eventual blossoming. Sullivan had planted evidence as Howard now planted flowers, trusting natural processes to bring beauty from darkness, truth from concealment. The earth remembers what men attempt to bury. Time reveals what power struggles to conceal. And sometimes in the quiet corners of history, justice arrives not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient inevitability of truth's emergence, tended by individuals who recognize that some principles transcend the limitations of their era. Howard Freeman had begun this journey as a retired intelligence analyst who noticed a strange mound behind his shed. He would complete it as the custodian of a legacy that spanned generations, the culmination of a mission begun before his birth by a man who trusted that someday someone would understand the significance of what he had buried. As stars appeared above the old house that had sheltered 3 generations of Sullivan's family, Howard felt the weight of Sullivan's watch in his pocket, the dog tags against his chest. Physical connections to a man he had never met but whose final mission he had completed. In their profession, such completion was rare. Operations often ended ambiguously. Successes remained unacknowledged. Sacrifices went unrecognized. Yet here, in this unlikely convergence of lives separated by decades, a kind of justice had finally emerged, not through courts or formal proceedings, but through the patient persistence of truth working its way upward, one layer at a time, until it finally reached the surface.